Have you ever shot a landscape that looked amazing when you stood in front of it, but when you put those files on your computer, the images looked a little bit kind of crap? Well, there's one reason why this happens, and it's all to do with how your eyes move through your photos. My name is Will, and I'm an award-winning landscape photographer based in the UK. And in this video, I'm going to show you the visual principle that the pros use to control how their photos get viewed, why this leads to award-winning photos rather than snapshots that get ignored, and the 4 simple steps that you can follow to apply this to any of your own landscape images. Okay, so take a look at this photo. Now, where did your eye go when you first looked at it? It likely came in from the bottom left corner of the frame at the rocks that slope upwards. Then it probably zigged and zagged around the rocks in the midground before settling on that tree at the top of the frame. And I bet you also had a split second pondering if this tree was shaped that way permanently or if it was just incredibly windy and it was being blown to one side in that moment. Now, that journey that you just went on didn't come down to chance. I acted like a tour guide purposely when I designed your journey, when I was out in the field, when I composed this very image. And this ability to control your viewer's eye as they look through your images is often the thing that separates snapshots from half-decent photos to award-winning images. Now, this is a skill that you've got to learn. It's something that you've got to kind of do consciously because it's not something that comes naturally to people because of how our brain works. So when we're stood in front of a beautiful scene, our eyes act differently to when they are staring at a 2D flat photograph of the same scene. When you're standing in the landscape, your eyes naturally scan and they prioritize certain parts of the environment in front of you. Your brain is filtering constantly. It's deciding what's important. It's trying to lock onto the brightest parts of the sky or that tree that's catching some beautiful light or the contrast along a ridge line. And then you add on top of this the wind, the rain, the heat, the cold, all of the elements that you're facing when you're looking over at this view, and it all becomes very visceral and it becomes a very emotive experience. When you take a photo of that scene and then you show it to someone who wasn't there to experience it firsthand, well, the whole visceral element of this experience no longer exists, and the image, because of this, can fall flat on its face. The way around this is to give the viewer a clear path to follow to reach the subject of the shot so that they're not getting lost, they're not getting bored, and we can tie emotion into that journey, and we do this proactively. We do this consciously with our composition and also how the image is edited. And this is because when the viewer's eye isn't guided, it drifts towards the edge of the frame. It drifts towards bright distractions or just random details that we're not really that fussed about within the image itself. And the viewer's eye grabs onto those things because they're different. They stand out, not because they actually matter. So if you can control what the viewer notices first, and then what they move on to, and then where they end up, your image stops looking so empty and flat and just frankly boring, and you can start to add back some of that visceral experience that was lost in the conversion from reality, which was epic, to that 2D interpretation of that reality. Now, if control is the goal, how do we practically control our viewers' eyes without having to physically hold onto them and drag their face around the image in the way that we want them to go? Okay, so let me give you an example. With this image, you probably looked at it, you saw the bright trees in the middle, and you started thinking, well, there's not actually much to this, it's a pretty crap photo. And you would be absolutely right. And this is because the human brain craves contrast and variety, and it's going to search automatically for what's different. In this photo, there is no interest. There is nothing for our eyes to lock onto and for our eyes to be led around the scene. Now, let's compare that to this highly contrasty black and white shot. Your brain probably immediately locks onto the point of high contrast in the foreground, then it probably followed the contrast of the leading line of the footpath until it reaches the mountains in the background that have, again, high contrast because it's a brighter part of the sky stood next to the darker mountains. And what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that contrast is king when it comes to controlling your viewer's gaze across your images. This is because your brain doesn't see light, it sees differences. We literally have specific neurons in our brains that detect vertical, horizontal, and diagonal edge orientations. And we also have these things called off-center, on-surround neurons within our retinas. Now, without going too deep into the science here, the center and the outer part of these neurons both detect light. Now, if these neurons are looking at a low contrast scene where light is hitting both parts of the neuron, so there's lots of just gray, low contrasty light across the entirety of the neuron, These two sensory parts cancel each other out and they tell your brain that there is low contrast. Alternatively, if there is a sharp edge, so dark next to light, and the neuron fires, your brain is going to say, look here. Your brain is wired to look for this and to pay more attention to these areas of high contrast. So if you want to guide your viewer's eye, start by building strong contrast and clear edges into your images. Your brain is literally wired to look for them. Now, knowing how to grab attention is just the start of this process. The real magic comes when you know where to drive that attention to. Okay, so these images are very different landscape photos, but they've got one thing in common. And what is that? Well, they both have a single key focal point. In this image, the focal point of the tree branch and the reflection of the tree branch coming out of the water are basically nothing but just hard contrast, dark and light, right? So it's very easy for your brain to pick it out, to find it within the frame. Now, with the second image, our brains have to work a tiny bit harder to follow the leading line that goes towards the tree, but the tree becomes the obvious focal point because even though there is soft light across the scene, it's a very foggy, misty environment, the tree still has more contrast than the very light background. So when you're trying to guide the viewer's eye towards a focal point, think of the focal point as being the main character in a story, and everything else within the frame should support that main character and their story and guide the viewer's attention to them. So let's take a look at a framework that you can follow to make this happen every time you press the shutter button. Step one is to be deliberate. So when you're composing your image, be deliberate as to where you want the viewer to end up. Because let's be real here, if you're not going to take the time and the effort to do this yourself, why should the viewer waste their time, energy, and mental brain power trying to work out the subject for you? So choose your main subject in the landscape when you're composing your image, rather than just hoping it exists when you get home to look at your images on the computer. Which leads on to step two, which is then to commit to a clear starting point. So you want to commit to a starting point that your viewer is going to enter your photo through. This could be a strong foreground element if you're doing a close-up wide-angle shot, or a leading line if you're doing more of a telephoto shot. And now that we have a starting point, we've got an end point to our image, it's time to join them together with some contrast. So contrast can come from really obvious things like paths, walls, benches, cracks in rocks, a tree, anything really, as long as there's contrast in that part of the scene. And what I mean by contrast is light next to dark, big next to small, sharp next to soft, some kind of contrast that sucks the viewer from where we're starting to where we want them to end up. And finally, now that we've captured a strong image, it's time to shape the contrast in our shot in the edit. So firstly, think about how you can brighten or darken the starting point, the main subject, and then the pathway between them in a, obviously a natural way, right? We don't want to overdo this and make the image look AI generated or a little bit over the top, but we do want them to stand out within the frame. I will then often add a vignette around the edge of an image to further increase the contrast around the scene to push the viewer's eye towards the main elements, which are almost always going to be towards the center of the frame. And it always surprises me how much more epic a photo can look with just a couple of simple adjustments like this in Lightroom or Photoshop. So now that you know how to control your viewer's eyes, watch this video to learn how to go from flat photos that no one really wants to be led around to professional looking images in just a couple of simple steps.